Everybody has held a baby, and everybody will know that that baby doesn't know who their mom is when they're a baby. An infant has no idea that the human holding them is their mom or dad. That develops over time. And yet, a baby knows when it's safe. The same thing with a person living with dementia. They can feel love. They may have no idea who you are. They may not know you're their spouse, their adult child, but when you come in and you connect with them, they will know that they are loved. They can feel it. We all can feel love.
Welcome back to the Dementia Collective. Today, we have the pleasure of being joined by Lizette Cloete. Lizette, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me, Andrew.
Of course, of course. So before we get into it, we always get a question directly asked by our village, which is our community Patreon. And one of them provided a question that I'm going to ask you now. A lot of dementia advice I'm seeing today focuses on comfort, validation, and reducing conflict. As Christians, we are also called to be set apart and focus on truth, wisdom, and discernment. How do you personally reconcile those things in dementia caregiving?
I think that is a wonderful question because the listener is 100% correct. The world does teach validation, but the way of the world's validation is whatever works, whatever is going to not escalate the difficulty that the person may be experiencing at that time. As a Christian, I believe that we are commanded to be truthful. We serve a God of truth, and so therefore we need to be able to be truthful. I also believe that you can validate a person without lying to them. It just means that you have to think through how are you going to answer the question without fabricating a lie. And so a technique I teach people is to understand that no person likes to be told no. So I don't start the conversation with no. I start it with yes, whatever the person has said. So they're trying to leave the house. Yes, it looks like you're trying to leave the house. And then you redirect and validate in the next sentence, not using the word but and. So yes, you're trying to leave the house because you think mom is at work. And it sounds like you're missing mom. Why don't you tell me about her? So validating what's going on, meeting the person where they are, and then providing them with a truthful answer, but not bringing them to my reality, but not all the way meeting them in what their misbelief is about whatever the situation is. So I hope that was helpful for the listener.
So you often hear a lot of this idea that their reality is so important. We should enter into their reality. And you gave a bit of an example and you touched on it. Can you dive a little bit more? Let's say that it is sundowning and I'm really upset. Let's kind of walk through what this could look like. So I'm personally with dementia and you're the support, the family, caregiver, whatever the dynamic is. I want to go home. I need to see my mom. They're waiting for me. It's dinner time. I need to go. Get me out of here.
That is such a common scenario, isn't it?
It is.
It's always hard to do the role playing part of it because so much of what when we're in the moment is we take cues off of the person that's with us, right? And so when as a person is living with dementia and their brain is changing, in essence, what is happening over time is that because they're not able to logically reason or think through what's going on, they are very emotionally sensitive to the emotions or the feelings that are in the room. And so oftentimes when somebody is starting to work themselves up, I want to go home. Where's my mom? I need to get out of the door. What happens with the caregiver too is because they're trying to de-escalate it, but then they start to perhaps be a little anxious because the last time it didn't work so well or whatever situation is coming into the room. So the part of the equation is really being able to keep your own emotional energy, your bandwidth under control, and at the same time meeting that person where they are. If they are truly believing I need to go home to my mom, then we need to look at the situation and say, okay, what is the emotion? I may be anxious, I'm afraid, I'm scared, I feel unsafe, right? So if we can meet that emotional need of that person is feeling unsafe, then perhaps we can start to de-escalate or change the situation. I usually will try as much as possible to stay in that moment with the person and then be able to use the techniques of validation, but without lying. And having said that, if they continue to escalate, sometimes we have to kind of go with the flow, right? We may have to get in the car and go for a drive. Not saying I'm going to take you to your mom, but oh, it seems like you want to go outside. Let's go for a drive. So the meeting the person emotionally where they are, and then listening for the clues that they are giving you about the situation that they are in, and also recognizing sometimes you're not going to be able to change what is going on, and how do we then manage or manage the expectations of myself as to what a successful outcome looks like. Did that make sense?
When you say manage myself, what do you mean by that?
So frustration for many caregivers is frequently in the gap, right? The gap between what is and what I want, or the gap between where the person is and where I think they should be, right? So it can go both ways. The gap is either I think my loved one, my husband, my wife, whoever it is, my mom, should be able to do certain things. And because they really are not able to do certain things, but because I believe that they are able to do those things, and then they don't do those things, I'm frustrated because they're really here and there's a gap between reality and expectation. And then the opposite is also true. Sometimes the person living with dementia does have the ability to do things, and we take it all away. And then they're frustrated because I'm actually still able to do certain aspects or certain things, but the family or the caregiver believes that they're here, they're not able to do it, and there's a gap. So when I say manage the expectations, it's the expectations of what I truly believe the outcome should be. I'll use a concrete example. I have a client right now, her mom has passed. However, she was struggling to get her dad, who also lives with some form of dementia, in the shower. And in our conversation, I asked her what the outcome is. What's the result she wants? And she said he needs to take a shower. And so my advisory role with her was, is that truly the outcome that we need? Is that he take a shower? Or is the outcome that we need he be clean? Because they're two different outcomes. The result is hygiene, right? But if we're unable to get him in the shower for whatever reason, and we've tried things and it's not working, when we expect that he has to take a shower, we're disappointed when he doesn't take a shower. But if we reframe it, that the purpose that we want here is hygiene, the purpose that we want is cleanliness, how else can I get the result, the outcome? And in doing that, I manage my expectations of what is realistic in this specific moment.
Hmm. Interesting. Interesting. Well, Lizette, let me introduce you to the audience right now. Lizette Cloete is the founder of Think Different Dementia, a Christian dementia advising ministry for caregivers facing situations that are becoming harder to manage, less reliable, and increasingly difficult to hold together over time. Her work is grounded in a biblical worldview that differs sharply from much of the modern dementia care world. She helps caregivers think clearly about what is changing, what responsibilities are increasing, and what may now require a different response, even when families themselves cannot yet fully see what is happening. Lizette believes people with dementia remain image bearers of God, that dementia follows recognizable patterns rather than random chaos, and that caregivers need truthful clarity as care needs increase, role shift, and strain begins to affect the entire family. Drawing on more than 30 years of experience as an occupational therapist and a dementia advisor, she works with Christian caregivers facing situations like increasing supervision needs, repeated safety concerns, caregiver exhaustion, family conflict, role confusion, and responsibilities that quietly keep expanding over time. Through advising, teaching, and podcasting, Lizette helps caregivers recognize when a caregiver's situation is no longer holding it together the way it once did and what faithful stewardship may now require. Lizette hosts the Dementia Caregiver Support for Christians podcast and lives in South Carolina with her husband, Lewis. Amazing. So can you talk about how did you enter into this space?
6 years ago, at the tail end of my career, I started to become very frustrated with what I was noticing in the dementia caregiving space. I joined a lot of very large Facebook groups with 40, 50,000 people in. And one of the things that I observed was this perpetual negative narrative related to dementia and dementia caregiving. Many people on these sites are feel anonymous and feel safe. And yes, I agree, there are frustrations and challenges to being a caregiver. But the anonymity allowed a lot of people to be extremely negative, and I call it the verbal vomit of just spewing everything out in the world. And it frustrated me because a lot of the information that are in, some of the information is good, but a lot of the information in those groups were not necessarily reliable. So that prompted me to start my business, Think Different Dementia,
How are you qualifying that they're not reliable? Like
based on my
what determination
based
is
on my 30 years of experience in listening to some of the responses of normal, everyday caregivers who have perhaps, their N of one or two, they've been caregivers for their mom or for their husband, as opposed to coming into this space having helped thousands of people over 30 years living with dementia.
so they were very person-centered,
They were very,
one-off case circumstance
yes,
rather than
this is what worked with my mom.
yeah.
Not this is what necessarily these are the better ideas, right? And so there is some good advice on these Facebook groups, and then sometimes there or not, right? And so I felt called to see if there is a way to help or access and provide more reliable information. Shortly after that, my father went through this was at the tail end of COVID. So I have the medical background in helping families and navigating dementia. And then my dad was diagnosed with mild cognitive impairment at the end of COVID because of multiple different medical things. And I turned into the family caregiver, not recognizing that I'd been a family caregiver since the age of 19. But when I was 19 years old, we didn't call them caregivers. It's kind of odd to think that caregivers weren't really called caregivers until almost the 2000s.
What happened at 19?
My mom had a massive aneurysm, and so she almost died and lived the remainder of her years with a significant right-sided hemiplegia because of her aneurysm. When I was 19, she was 42. But at 19, in the late 80s, caregiving, the word caregiving was not a normal part of speaking. It wasn't even truly in the medical model yet. It only really started to come out in the early 2000s into the medical model, and then later than that, even into normal, you know, conversations where people were identified as family caregivers, professional caregivers. So the term caregiver really is a relatively newer term. Um, and so becoming recognized finally that I'm a family caregiver, I was struggling to understand why I was having such a hard time, because I have all of the professional skills in order to be a caregiver. I know how to transfer. I know how to help with, all of the skill set that comes with it. And yet, as a daughter, I was having a hard time coping with all of this stuff, putting the whole thing together. And so I started researching and learning more about caregiving, the category of caregiving, what that truly means, from a caregiver centered perspective. So the medical centered perspective and then the caregiver centered perspective. And despite having those two things in my corner, so to say, I was still having a very difficult time coping with and dealing with being a caregiver. And so, being a Christian, finally one day out of sheer frustration, I'm like, okay, Lord, I don't know. I don't know how to make this easier for people. What works? This doesn't work. This doesn't work. Okay, what works? And then I really started to stop and look at the whole lens of both dementia, the diagnosis, the process, as well as being a caregiver, living as a family member of somebody living with a progressive neurological disorder. How do you navigate this as a believer? And then I started to really put together, you know, I've been a Christian, I can't remember how long. I don't have a specific conversion event, but I don't remember ever not being a believer. I remember not living like a believer, but I don't remember not ever believing. And so in that whole process, I really started to look at this through the lens of scripture, through God's word. What does God say about these things? Ecclesiastes says there's nothing new under the sun, so caregiving has been around pretty much since the beginning. And in an ultimate sense, God is the ultimate caregiver. He provides us everything that we need.
So why do you think it's so much harder for family caregivers than professionals, whether it's healthcare aides or occupational therapists or mm, hired nursing staff, whatever it is? Why do you think it's harder for families to be caregivers than those individuals?
I think that professional caregivers also have difficulty sometimes being a professional caregiver. However, I think probably primarily some of the biggest differences is we bring our baggage to the table, right? We have history. Um, if you are a spousal caregiver, this is the husband or wife that you dated when you were younger and got married to and raised children with and were equals and partners in life. And now your roles and responsibilities are changing. If you are the adult child who is the caregiver, you have all of the drama and the dynamics and the things that happened and you experienced as a child coming into your relationship now as a caregiver, which makes things significantly different from a practical, tangible perspective, because caregiving brings to light all of what you actually believe to be true about relationships, about the world, about how the world works, about death, about dying, about God. If you don't believe in God, you bring what you believe about the world into your caregiving as a part of the equation. And so your values, your roles, your norms, the things that make me me and make you you are different. Your culture, all of these parts are a part of the whole picture. And we oftentimes forget to look at some of the things in the past that may be contributing to what we're seeing in the future or in the here and now. So, for example, I've had children, adult children, who are primary caregivers of a person who perhaps had been molesting them as a child. And I don't believe that it is required that that adult child, necessarily be the one to provide the physical hands-on care for the person who had perpetrated those sins against their body. So that's a very extreme example.
But I
These,
assume it's a real world one you've
oh,
probably navigated.
100% a real world one, right? So I'll use myself as an example. Never had anything like that happen to me. However, my father is an atheist and I am a believer. Growing up in my father's house was extremely difficult. He's an angry man. He has always been an angry man. And my parents had placed my sister and I as young children in boarding school. I was 12 years old, and I actually experienced going to boarding school, had a really great childhood growing up, as almost my parents passing away and dying. So I grieved them like they had died at the age of 12,
Wow.
which caused a significant rift in our relationship because the only way I knew as a 12-year-old kid to actually emotionally protect myself was to build a wall. Because every 6 months we would go home. My sister and I would compete for my parents' attention. We're young. We were very young. And then you'd get on a plane and go, and you kind of felt like you were abandoned, right?
How far away would this boarding school have been from your
We
home?
were
Because
in
it was,
South
I assume it was in
Africa.
South Africa as well, right?
We were in South Africa, and they were in Sweden. So every 3-4 months, we would get on a plane, fly from South Africa to Sweden. Two
The
kids on
school,
our
the
own.
school was in Sweden, and your parents were in
Well,
South Africa.
we were in South Africa, and they lived in Sweden. Yeah.
So were you born in Sweden?
No, I was born in South Africa.
Oh, so your parents.
My dad was a diplomat. So his station was in Sweden, but the emotional result was abandonment. And for decades, I could not talk about being in boarding school without literally falling into a little emotional puddle on the floor, bawling my eyes out. Over time, the Lord allowed me to see it allowed me to see His goodness in taking me out of my biological father's sphere and placing me under my grandmother, who was a believer, who raised us in the church, which allowed me to be much more grounded than what I likely would have been otherwise. And then over time, the Lord allowed me to see how that very difficult situation was for my good and for His glory. And I have no animosity, no anger, no anything towards my dad and what had happened. And so for me to be his primary caregiver For decades, I said I would never live with him, right? And literally in the span of a 30-second conversation with somebody, I walked out the door and said to my husband, we need to move in with my dad. And all of that, I would never live with him, I would never live with him, went away, right? It's only the Lord that can change your heart like that. But all of that to say, this baggage that we have, back to the example of a child who might have been molested by a parent, who is now required to be that person's primary caregiver, has to be factored in when we are making recommendations and when we're looking at the picture of what's going on. Because we've all seen people living with dementia who are who were the super, super nice, sweet people who cuss up a storm, or the super, super angry people who are now the sweetest person anybody has ever met. And then the society will often just look at the situation right now and not zoom out and say, okay, that daughter is not coming to visit their mom, but we don't know what happened when they were 5.
Hmm. Did you have any experience as a child with anyone living with dementia? So if you said you went to the boarding school at 12, maybe, I assume it was your experience with seniors and elders was limited when you're in the boarding school. But before, or did you have any experience with dementia, cognitive impairment, things of this nature?
I do not remember as a child anybody in particular that would be a person that I can retrospectively now look back and say, oh, they might have been living with dementia. I can trace back the first person that I now am 100% sure in retrospect was living with dementia and was misdiagnosed. Part of my training in South Africa was we had to go to a psychiatric unit, and I had a adult geriatric psychiatric rotation. And many of the people in the geropsych ward at that time were probably living with dementia, but their diagnosis was depression or something else. And I'll never forget this particular woman. I'm 100% sure now that she was living with dementia. She would walk up to me and just stand right in front of me, and petite little thing. And she told me every single time, she's like, I'm so tired. I'm so very, very tired. And she was pacing up and down the facility, up and down the building.
Mm-hmm.
And I was 18, 19, 20 years old. I had no idea what to do with her. And we, you know, I've been an OT for 34 years this year. 34 years ago, the diagnosis of dementia was not as vastly recognized or known. And so people were often probably misdiagnosed earlier on than what they are now. But that particular woman, I will never forget, because with the skills and the experience I have now, I know what I would have done with her now, but I didn't have the skill set then.
How did your relationship with your grandmother lead you into this? Because it sounds like you had a really close relationship with her. And it sounds like the way you're explaining it to me is the way that she was caring and putting you guys first and looking after you is really the same approach. And, really frankly, the love that you're embodying for these folks that are being cared for by your caregivers. Am I correct on this road?
My grandmother was a very godly woman. And I think the influence that my grandmother has on me is a lot more than sometimes I necessarily would recognize. When you grow up in an unbelieving household. So my parents did not raise us in the church, even though culturally in South Africa people were in the church. It doesn't necessarily mean that they were true born again believers, but there was a cultural Christianity, very strong cultural Christianity. And my grandmother, I really do believe, was a born again believer. But my parents were very worldly. They had a very worldly life. And so if you were to contrast my parents with my grandmother, and you're 16, 17, 18 years old, and you really don't understand life yet. It just looks like my grandmother was old-fashioned, right? The reality was my grandmother was never really old-fashioned. She was just godly. And I didn't have the words to be able to describe what a Proverbs 31 woman would look like other than old-fashioned, right? So my grandmother was a tremendous influence on me. I honestly believe without my grandmother, my life would look significantly different. Um, she was prickly, but she was kind. She never wanted people to give her a hug or things like that, but she was always kind and always self-sacrificially served other people.
So, how did you get, what led you into OT and occupational therapy?
That's a really great question. One would think that it was my mom's stroke. However, I was already in occupational therapy school when she had her stroke. So I will try to keep this short, but my dad was a diplomat for the South African government. So I actually started school in the United States as a child. So we lived in New York from the age of 3 until 8. So my schooling started in the US, and the United States academic calendar runs September, May, and the South African one runs January, December. And I'm a
So,
September
full 12
baby.
months in South
But
Africa?
yeah, just the academic. So our school starts in January, right? And the United States school starts in September through the following
Yeah,
year.
yeah.
So I'm a September baby. So living in the United States, I went to school at the appropriate time, probably a little bit young, but not super young, because I'm a September baby. And then when we moved back to South Africa, I was in the first or second grade. And because of the academic school year, they had to make a decision up or down because I was halfway in between. So they put me in the year ahead. So when I actually graduated high school, I turned 16 in September and graduated high school in December. Sorry, I was 16 the whole year and turned 17 and graduated. So I was almost a whole year younger than my peers.
So, you just turned 17 when you
Yeah,
finished.
barely just turned
Wow.
17 when I graduated high school. Now, if you know anything about cognitive development, you don't really have a lot of what you need by then. I was not the world's best academic student, just some people are brilliant, right? And some people have to work harder. But what that ended up was going to university. I really didn't have a clue of what I wanted to study. So the first year I took a pretty general education thing, and you can take aptitude tests, but you have to be 18. So I had to wait almost a year before I could take an aptitude test. After taking the aptitude test, the three strengths that I had was art, psychology, and science. And occupational therapy was the only degree that combined all three. So that is how I got into OT.
And was your 30-year career in the dementia space doing OT work?
So my 30-year career, probably the last 20, has been working in the dementia space. I started as a new grad. I literally graduated in 1992, and October 93 is when we immigrated to the United States. So when I started working in the United States, I worked in skilled nursing facilities and started to notice that many people who were unable to go back home were not unable to go home, contrary to what I had believed, because they physically couldn't take care of themselves. They ended up staying in a facility because they cognitively couldn't take care of themselves. They couldn't think, which meant they couldn't go home. So it was more limiting for people in a facility. Yes, there's a physical component, right, to needing additional physical care. But a lot of people who could walk or do things couldn't go home because they couldn't think for themselves. And that was when I started to really learn about how to help thinking processes. When I started, that looked like strokes and head injuries and things like that. And then pretty early on in my career, I noticed I have a real affinity for working with people with dementia. And then I continued to self-educate and learn and read books and go to courses and do those kinds of things. And one day I just turned around, I'm like, oh, I'm a subject matter expert in dementia. It just kind of snuck up on me, but I love doing it.
So in your bio, you specifically say that your work is grounded in a biblical worldview that differs sharply from much of the modern dementia care world. Can you talk about what that means specifically, that differs sharply from the modern dementia care world
100%.
and what people are seeing and experiencing?
So if you are an observant person, if you listen to what people say about a person living with dementia, what the world says about a person living with dementia, you will hear things like they're losing themselves, they're not themselves anymore, all of this lost language, the doom and gloom, and woe is me. Yes, people living with dementia have real, actual physical changes to their brain. However, when you approach it from a they're not the same person anymore, they're losing themselves, then it's very easy to just s- see the loss. Also, the world very much has a view that if you cannot think for yourself, you are less valuable. And that we equate in the Western world to a large extent people's ability to think equals their value. And so when you lose the ability to think for yourself, you are becoming less valuable over time as a person. And if you're observant, you can pick this up everywhere in the research, in how people speak about people living with dementia. Um, and so from a biblical perspective, I believe people are created in God's image. And because we're created in God's image, we have value. And we intuitively, as Christians, know this to be true when it is a child who is born with some significant impairment and doesn't develop fully. We do not see that child as any less valuable because they cannot think. We love them and they're created in God's image. And yet, even in the church, when a person has had the ability to think and that ability changes over time, the church has also taken on to a large extent that lost language and sees that person over time as less valuable. And they're not. They are created in God's image. And that is a stark, stark difference to what the world is actually teaching and saying about people living with cognitive loss and cognitive impairment. The second part of it is the world is also very quick to say that, if you've met one person with dementia, you've met one person with dementia, right? There's no order, there's no commonality. And the reality is we serve a God of order, and there is order in the world. When you've met one person, you've met one person. But we all, to a large extent, if we have normal development, we all know. I would meet you in a room, and I would know you're a human, right? You're a man. You're Andrew, and your life experiences, etc., make you unique and different from me. But yet we're the same, and there is order in how we both developed into adults, right? So the same is true related to dementia. and progressive decline, there is order to it when you know what to look for. And so that's the second part of what I believe, is that it isn't confusing. There is structure to it. It's dependent on so much more than just, retrogenesis and things like that, because our lives are ordered and God is a God of order. And then the third part of it is the therapeutic truth telling, which is diametrically opposed to therapeutic fibbing or therapeutic lying, which is commonly taught in most dementia education, teaches people to validate by lying.
It's a fine line between how do you affirm and support versus perpetuate a fallacy. It's such a fine line, right?
So I would reframe it from perpetuating a fallacy, because that person is living in that time and space in their head, right? They truly believe that to be true.
Yes.
They're not making it up, right? And so most of those experiences have truth in the background because it was their life. They're, to a large extent, what we see are normal outflowings of whatever life history they had. So I'll use this as just a tangible example. I had a patient many, many years ago who would not take a shower. We all know that's one of the big things, right? And as I was working with him, I found out more of his history growing up. He had grown up in West Virginia in the 30s, 40s. 9 out of 9 kids, he was the 9th. They only took a bath. They never took a shower. And he was the kid that got the cold, dirty bath water at the end. He didn't want to take a bath. He didn't want to take a shower. I wouldn't want to either, right? And so his wife, back to the manage expectations, his wife was perpetually upset because he wouldn't take a shower, right? So most of my working with her was managing her expectation about what it means. Like, we can take a sponge bath, we don't need to take a shower, all of this stuff. But I had her document when he would spontaneously take a shower. And it was about every 7 to 10 days, he would spontaneously go take a shower. And so if you looked at his past history, he grew up only taking a shower or bath once a week. And for the rest of the time, they probably swam or did sponge bathing or something else, right? Or they maybe not did anything. So when I look at a situation like that, his norm was only once a week. And so when we're then superimposing other requirements or other constraints on top of that, that's when we cause the conflict. Back to what we talked about earlier on, what is the outcome I want of that thing? I want him to be clean. And so knowing the person's personal history, because that's where he was living, that's the time frame he was in, allowed us to construct a more effective way of taking care of him, and at the same time being able to manage his wife's expectations about why he is not ever going to take a shower every single day. And is that still a reasonable thing to expect?
So how would you suggest that, from two different lenses, a Christian person is hired, or maybe it's you caring for your dad? How do you wrestle with, my faith says this is how I have to approach it, when the person doesn't believe it? So in the case of you and your dad, or the other way around, where you don't have faith, but this person you're caring for does. So two sides really of the same coin. How would you advise families navigate that? Because as we're seeing, the secular world is, it's
A
becoming
hundred
very
percent.
prominent. So how, people have to navigate this
Yep.
relationship.
So in the case of they're four different groups, right? So you have two unbelievers taking care of an unbeliever and a believer, an unbelieving caregiver and a believing, or an unbelieving caregiver and an unbelieving care receiver. Their dynamic is going to look different than, say, two believing caregiver and a care receiver, right? But what you pointed out was the believing caregiver, like me, with my father who is an unbeliever, right? I do not have certain things in my arsenal to help me with my dad because he's not a believer. And so I've had two a believing caregiver and a believing care receiver, where the person living with dementia was doing something that at first we were trying to solve from a how do we fix the problem perspective. And then it became evident, we tried everything, that it was actually sin, right? She was doing it on purpose and she was sinning. And so the believing caregiver could go to her mom and say, Mom, you are sinning against me. Mom got super mad, stormed off, went to bed. Next day came out and told her daughter, yes, you were right. I was doing this on purpose. Please forgive me. So that's a tool, an arsenal as a believer that you have when you're two believing people in that situation. Me with my dad, if my dad sins against me, I can't go to him and say, Dad, you sinned against me, because he doesn't believe in sin. He doesn't believe it. So I cannot expect my dad, who is an unbeliever, to respond like a believer. I cannot expect him to be anything other than an unbeliever. And so when he gets mad at me, which happens, I have to, as a believer, understand that the wages the wages of sin is death, and he's mad at me, and I cannot confront him on that level. I have to figure out a way around it, right? So back to now, you are a person who is living with dementia, who has unbelievers who are taking care of you, whether that be another family member or whether that be a paid caregiver. It is harder when you are the person living with dementia if you do not have an advocate for you that is a believer that can meet that Christian need and desire that you have, because you will not be getting it from your caregivers. And that is where I've had clients like this before, where the power of attorney or whoever is an unbelieving child, and the person living with dementia is a believer, but they have a child who's a believer as well. And so then it's up to the extended family to come around them and support and help them from a Christian worldview. If you're in a facility and you've been in a church, then my hope and prayer is that your church is supporting you from a Christian worldview. But yet again, a believer cannot expect an unbeliever to act like a believer. It doesn't happen.
And I think a uncomfortable dynamic is, the person with dementia that is a believer, but their family can't take on the onus all the time. Maybe the family is believers and they can only do so much. They really can't expect them to be there 24/7, do all this. So they bring in folks alongside. But a lot of the time, the folks we're bringing in for this companion or home care, companion care kind of world may not be believers. They may not have raised that way and exposed to that sort of thing. You're bringing that narrative in, and then you're having to try and wrestle with, like, how do you approach this properly? How do you bring the right people in? How do you vet those right people? And how do you navigate that relationship?
100%. And, from a practical, tangible perspective, what is the outcome that I want with that paid caregiver in my house, right? If I'm a believing family, what is the thing that I'm truly looking for? Am I looking for that person to meet my mom's spiritual needs or my loved one's spiritual needs? Then hiring a person who has the same worldview is going to be more important. If my ultimate goal is that I'm struggling to find reliable help, I'm struggling to find the right caregiver, I'm struggling to whatever, I need the right person who can do the skill set, and I can take care of the spiritual component on my own. A family has to wrestle with that on their own. There's no right or wrong. All of us live in different parts of the world and have different access to different caregiving people, right? So I live in the I live in the South in the United States, in South Carolina. There are a lot of caregivers who are believers. There are a lot of caregivers who are not. I have had families who are specific and looking for another person of faith to be their primary caregiver. It happens. It, nobody can answer that question for another family other than, yourself, what works for you and for your family. Because if you're trying to keep somebody at home, then maybe the physical hands-on care is more important than the spiritual component of having a believing caregiver.
Where do you think churches are missing the mark then on supporting caregivers, or are they?
I think that is a very good question. I think that some churches do this better, obviously. Some church it's just like, you have nursing homes that are great and you have nursing homes that are terrible, right? Part of, I think, the biggest narrative in the church itself, back to what I said about being diametrically opposed to what the world teaches, is many people equate my ability to think with my value. And so often what I see happening in a church is this conversation. Husband and wife go to the doctor. Husband is diagnosed with dementia, right? Early onset, early stages. Get in the car with the wife and say these following words: I don't want anybody to know. So
Happens all the time.
immediately what happens is now we have isolated that couple, whether it be a believing family or a not believing family, right? The where some of this, and it's hard, right? Because anosognosia is a thing. I don't believe that this is happening. But when a dyad, when a husband and wife, when a couple, when a parent, or whoever the person is, does not want other people to know that they have this process going on. It's not like, I'm in a car accident, I lose my arm, I lose my leg, people can see I'm an amputee, right? This is a physical change going on in the brain that is not evident to people necessarily when you see them. And at the same time, as it continues over time, it is evident to other people what is going on. And so in a church context, what happens frequently is that conversation. I don't want anybody to know I'm living with this. The family starts to become isolated. Maybe they still go to church because it's at the early stages. And now, because the person living with these actual real brain changes are starting to not act and be and react the way they always did. And it becomes evident to people, but they don't know what to do with it because nobody has said Bob has dementia or Susie is living with dementia, right? And so what happens is the church leadership has nothing that they can really do to help you. Friends and families don't necessarily know how to accommodate because we're not having these open conversations. And so I think over time, as certain diagnoses are becoming more prevalent in society, and I'll just use autism as an example. Um, a lot of churches are now developing larger churches like sensory rooms and things like that, right, for children living with autism. Same concept related to dementia and dementia caregiving. How can we continue to keep that person in the church as long as we possibly can by modifying the environment or um, assigning a person who can stay with them in a quieter area so that the primary caregiver can go to worship? I think there are a lot of things that we could be doing, but it's going to start with having more open conversations. And my biggest request, if anybody is listening to this and they're wrestling with this, if you go to church and you have a diagnosis of dementia, you're caring for somebody living with dementia, your first conversation should be with the pastor and the leadership of the church so that they can come around you, not for any other reason than help, tangible help over time. People cannot help if they don't know. And they won't know unless we start to talk about this.
So I kind of been thinking through this idea of, there's this sacrificial love, right? That I should and I want to do whatever it takes for my loved ones, even if it is to my own disservice. It's hard on me because, that's ultimately what Jesus did for us. This notion of I will give everything I have for this person. But when we talk about caregiving burnout is a reality that needs to
100%.
happen. And caregivers need to look after themselves too. So how would you advise Christian caregivers to navigate this
Mm.
notion of sacrificial love while not burning yourself out as well?
I think that is a brilliant question. And the word that I'm going to use is caregiving is stewardship. Our life is a sequence of stewardship. Everything in our life is stewardship. We tend to think in, People tend to think in terms of stewardship, often just in terms of financial resources, right? So tithing and things like that is stewardship. Stewardship is all encompassing. Everything that the Lord has given me as a particular human, I'm to steward my talents, my time, my financial resources, my effort. All of that is stewardship. And sacrificial love is not self-sacrificial. Jesus is the only one who did self-sacrificial love, right? Sacrificial love doesn't mean I throw myself under the bus. It means that I still have to steward this whole thing for God's glory, for my good and for God's glory, right? So if I physically do not have the energy level to do all of these things, and God has required that I steward it for His good, it doesn't mean that I have to be the person providing the hands on care, right? Each person's situation, and I recognize this is a global statement, right? But every person's situation is different. Every person has different financial resources, human resources, friends, family, church, um, time. Everybody gets the same amount of time. We're in different seasons of our life. If you are a husband wife combination working through this problem, your stewardship looks different than if you're the adult daughter who is stewarding this with my husband taking care of my dad, but I don't have children in my life. My children are grown and flown versus you. I know you have a little one. If you were
True.
in this situation, right, as a man with a wife and children, your primary responsibility biblically is your wife and children, not your parents. So we have to steward, we have to look at this from a stewardship perspective How do I steward this whole journey well? So every person is commanded by God to look at their resources, their time, their talents, and steward it well. It doesn't mean that we do it to the detriment of ourselves, but we have to come up with the solution to provide the care. So I don't know if that kind of helped.
So you've worked across multiple countries and frankly continents, right? And so you've seen a lot of things. Um, when we talk about a lot of non-North American communities, it is really to the idea of, sure, in my case, I've got wife and kids and stuff, and I look after them. But there's also this notion for, let's say, international families, international communities, that the child has an obligation to the parents, that the child has to look after the parents. So essentially, they're really stuck in this, sandwich of, how do I support everyone? And I looked after you. The Bible says, look after your parents, respect your parents, these sort of things. And so they're really stuck. I find in North American communities that it's less, not saying it's gone, but it is less than Latin America, Southern Asian communities, uh, some of these regions. So what's your take on that?
At the start of our conversation, we talked about roles, responsibilities, etc. Culture was one of the things that I mentioned. And so from a cultural perspective, yes, there are cultural differences for sure. And a lot of these cultures where it is culturally expected that you will take care of your family member, it is usually in the context of multiple people doing the work. Um, a lot of those societies are set up for that. And having said that, yes, it is hard. And culture is something that we need to keep in mind as we are working through these problems. And at the same time, you have to still steward your own life well. No, Christianity has lots of different, I don't even know what word I want to use. We'll just use denominations. And so sometimes what one person's emphasis might be a little bit different than somebody else's emphasis. And so we want to be gracious and give people kindness, but also let people know and understand that it is okay to ask for help. You're not, no one, probably the biggest takeaway for most people today should be this: one person cannot take care of a person living with dementia by themselves. It takes more than one person. It is not, nobody can be on duty 24 hours a day.
It takes a village, and that's why our Patreon is named The
Percent,
Village.
right? So that is the thing, right? You cannot do it alone. No person can do it alone. I couldn't do it alone. I have people who help me. My husband helps me. We have other people who help us. We're not at a stage where we're needing more help. And we have to, from a cultural perspective, we do need to keep that in mind, that different cultures have different expectations, and then we have to manage our expectations within that. I'll use this as a really quick, tangible example. Many years ago, when I was young and dumb as an OT, um, I had a lot of Vietnamese patients, and Vietnamese people have a cultural expectation that if something happens to me as an elder, you will take care of me and I don't need to do anything. Well, what is the definition of occupational therapy? It is teaching people to do things for themselves, in essence, right? So here in the Western world, this person would be in the hospital, and my job in the hospital or in the home health or whatever is to try to teach them to get dressed. And after a while, I started to realize and recognize This is not culturally what this is what the insurance company wants, but this is not what this specific person needs, right? Their family needs to know how to take care of them the easiest way that they can. Because when that person goes home from rehab, they're not going to get dressed by themselves. Somebody is going to dress them because it's culturally acceptable. For me, from the Western world, might look different or strange, but why am I forcing my cultural and insurance beliefs on this family? So how do I make their life in this cultural context easier for them? How do I help them navigate this in a cohesive fashion and find the help that they particularly need in order to keep that person wherever they need to?
Interesting. Well, Lizette, let's shift to lightning round. What is your favorite hymn?
Ooh, I have When Peace Like a River comes up, and then, oh goodness, what is my favorite hymn? I have so many. Um, we'll stick with When Peace Like a River.
Who's your favorite disciple?
Paul.
Coffee or tea?
Coffee all day.
Calf or decaf?
Oh, absolutely not decaf.
The listeners at this point are probably tired of this question because every single person, except one, said caffeinated coffee, and then the person said tea, said right after he has his cup of tea, like a Britishman, then he will go to heavily caffeinated coffee. So I'm the only decaf person that's ever shown up on here, I think.
So if I drink tea, I only drink rooibos, which is decaffeinated.
We'll call that close.
So I drink coffee during the day and I drink tea at night.
Early bird or night owl?
Hard question. When my husband's with me, I am an early bird. When my husband's not with me, I'm a late owl. He doesn't sleep. And so he wakes up at 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning. So we get started earlier and we go to bed. We have a very strict sleep hygiene. When he's gone, my night owl will come out. So both.
Who would play you in a movie?
Have no clue.
Who would
Really?
you want to play you?
I have no clue. I never thought of that.
Most
I
people
couldn't
have.
even come up with a person's name, to be fair.
No, I would say Matthew McConaughey just because I want to hear him talk.
Oh, that's fun.
For me, not for you.
No, I
For
got
me.
that.
Obviously, he's quite a bit older than me, but it is what it is.
Now,
He could play a future version of me.
there you go.
Multiverse breaking movie. What is your go-to version or translation of the Bible?
To the ESV and the NASB. I alternate between the two of them. And then if I really don't know, then I'll go to the New King James.
Oh, okay. What still reaches people late in their dementia?
Singing.
We've had people on here talk about the power of music and hymns.
Singing, hymns, power of music, smells, the sound of your voice.
It's like you picked my next question. What smell still reminds you of your childhood?
Smells remind me of my childhood. Ooh, I don't know. Dirt. I played in the dirt a lot.
And yet you're allergic to it.
Grass. Mown grass.
What do families worry about that really doesn't matter that much?
That's good. What do families worry about that they really shouldn't worry about? Okay. I think that we worry about end-stage dementia too much and too little. Both. If a person lives long enough with dementia, they will have end-stage dementia and they will pass away, right? Sometimes people focus only on that, not recognizing that the person you love can pass away from something else before you even get there. So you're worrying about something that may never happen. And then also sometimes people don't worry about if they live long enough, you will need 24-hour care. So both.
What's your favorite Bible verse?
Oh, trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him and he will make your path straight.
What tells someone that you feel like a safe person for them?
What tells someone?
Yeah, whether spoken or unspoken.
I would just hope that I'm approachable and open, and I am what I am. You get me when you like this is me. This is me, whether I'm in the room with you or not.
What gets lost too early in the dementia journey?
Joy. Everybody has held a baby, and everybody will know that that baby doesn't know who their mom is when they're a baby. An infant. An infant has no idea that the human holding them is their mom or dad. That develops over time, right? And yet, a baby knows when it's safe. The same thing with a person living with dementia. They can feel love. They may have no idea who you are. They may not know their spouse, their adult child, but when you come in and you connect with them, they will know that they are loved. They can feel it. We all can feel love.
Books or music?
Books.
What comforts you when your mind is tired?
Chocolate.
White, dark, milk chocolate?
Uh, dark chocolate. Nothing with peanut butter touching it.
You allergic to peanut butter too?
No, I don't like Reese's. I know, right? That was for your audience. Peanut butter and chocolate should never touch.
No. No. Reese's is one of the few perfect chocolate bars and
Like
chocolate things.
everybody's that's a food group. No, it's not.
Oh yeah, I mean you can put that put pretzels in it, you put popcorn in it. Like there's
Yeah.
so many great variations. What do you like better, routine or flexibility?
I fly by the seat of my pants within a structured routine. We have a very structured, like get up at the same time, go to bed at the same time. But for the rest, I fly by the seat of my pants.
What's one thing that long-term care needs more of?
People who are helpers. Staff to patient ratio. There's,
What gives you hope right now?
what gives me hope right now? That this is not as good as it gets.
And what's the most human thing that's happened to you lately?
The most human thing?
Yeah.
Ooh, I have no idea how to even answer that. The most human thing. Walking with our dog. We got to walk the dog twice a day.
That's too much for me. My dog's legs are about this long and on block and he's having a nap.
We inherited a dog. We inherited my daughter's pit bull mix. So and then we moved into a condo. And we never were dog walking people, and now we got to walk the dog twice a day. So it's a little human. I love
Yeah.
chickens, like my backyard chickens. That makes me happy.
Terrifying. Terrifying to me. I'm terrified of birds. Well, Lizette, I always give the guest the last opportunity to say something to the audience. So what would you want to leave them with?
We have to remember that our hope is not here. Our hope is in eternity. It is very easy to get embroiled in the day to day because it is hard and it is challenging and it's got multiple facets to it. And if you believe in the Lord Jesus Christ, the person you love that you're taking care of, if they're a believer, they're going to be in heaven, and all of that is going to have gone away. And to keep your eyes on eternity, and that that the Lord, who is good and kind, even though I do not understand why, has decreed that this is a part of your story, and to embrace it and to learn from it and not to experience it as a traumatic event, but something that is forming you into who you are supposed to be.
Well, Lizette, thank you so much for joining us. I appreciate coming here talking about the intersectionality of, Christian faith, caregiving, and dementia. So I appreciate you coming here. So thank you so much.
You are welcome. Thank you for having me.
Of course. And to our listeners, thank you as well for being here. If today's conversation resonated with you, make sure to follow the Dementia Collective wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget, like, share, and comment. It will make a world difference helping this reach more people. And if you'd like to help us grow this movement, please consider becoming a member of the Village on Patreon. Among the benefits, like the ability to ask questions to our guests, you'll get early access to every episode, plus the satisfaction of helping powerful voices like Lizette's reach more caregivers around the world. And finally, if you're on your own caregiving journey, remember, you are not alone. We're here at BlueBell to help connect you with the supports and resources that truly fit your family's unique needs. Until next time, remember, you are strong, you are not alone, and you are doing something that matters more than you know. I'll see you next time.